Segundo panel del día, Generación de evidencia para las políticas públicas. En este panel contamos con la presencia de la maestra Thania de la Garza, Directora General Adjunta de Evaluación del Consejo Nacional de Evaluación de la Política de Desarrollo Social, quien fungirá como moderadora. La acompañan la doctora Vivian Welch, editora en jefe de Campbell, el doctor Emmanuel Jimenez, director ejecutivo de 3IE, y el doctor Gonzalo Hernández Licona, secretario ejecutivo de CONEVAL.
Hola, buen día a todos. A todos y a todas. Me da muchísimo gusto darles la bienvenida a este panel de discusión que tiene como objetivo analizar los diferentes tipos para generar evidencia, ¿no? Hemos hablado desde ayer el tema de cómo es posible diseminar la evidencia, y la idea de este panel es no solo hablar de ciertos métodos para generar evidencia, sino también de buenas prácticas para diseminarla con actores relevantes en términos de políticas públicas. A partir de ahorita el panel va a ser en inglés, entonces todos aquellos que necesiten el aparato para traducción lo pueden tener en la entrada, porque todos los colegas van a estar hablando en inglés. So, good morning, everyone. So, this is the discussion panel, Generation of Evidence for Public Policies. And actually, I'm very glad that I can present these wonderful colleagues, that they have so much experience in impact evaluations. So, let me present them to you. Here is Vivian Welch. She is editor-in-chief of the Campbell Collaboration. Good morning. Also is Emmanuel Jimenez, executive director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, known as 3IE. And also is Gonzalo Hernández Licona, executive secretary of CONEVAL. So we're starting. We're going to have this presentation around 15 minutes, and then we will be open for a group reflection. So we start with Vivian. Vivian has a PhD in population health by University of Ottawa and a master's degree in kinesiology and aerospace physiology by York University. She has more than 20 years of experience in the use of systematic evidence reviews methods in collaboration with Cochrane and Campbell Collaboration. She also has developed several researches about public health, public economy, health evidence, translation and equity, and clinical guidelines. She has held several leadership positions in the Breyer Research Institute, as well as in Cochrane and in Campbell Collaboration, which are global organizations in the generation and promotion of high-quality evidence for decision-making about public policy development. Vivian also has a wide academic production developed through her academic and professional background with around 130 publications between high-quality papers and books. She is currently editor-in-chief of Campbell Collaboration, where she is responsible for ensuring the quality of evidence synthesis studies published.
Thank you very much, Thania, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here, to Gonzalo for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to mainly focus on systematic reviews, why systematic reviews play a role in evidence to policy. A few caveats about what types of systematic reviews, not all reviews are the same, and a few other tools within the realm of systematic reviews. And I should just say thanks to Howard White, our CEO of Campbell Collaboration, who couldn't be here today. Many of these slides are borrowed from some of Howard's presentations. So I wanted to start with something a little controversial, because I know that Thania wants to have a debate and a discussion, this might get you started, that most public policies don't work. So in a lot of fields, there's good evidence that many things have weak or no positive effects. So what do we do when we are faced with this situation? We need to find the evidence of those things which are effective and in which context they're effective. Okay, so, you know, I'm a little bit biased, but my answer is systematic reviews. You know, I did want to stimulate some debate. Systematic reviews, you know, only include high quality evidence of effects. They can include experimental designs as well as quasi-experimental study designs, which take account of selection bias. So they are looking at cause and effect questions. They have clear eligibility criteria, comprehensive search, and they try to minimize bias, and they should be reported transparently. So this is too small for you to read. It's a strategy for the Campbell collaboration, which I'll just tell you has a foundation of building the methods for doing reviews, so doing high quality reviews, and building capacity for doing those reviews. And then really developing tools to support the use of those reviews in policy. We have 9 groups now, and I don't want to linger too long on this, but we have groups in education, international development, social welfare, crime and justice, and we have new groups coming in nutrition, disability, business and management, and knowledge translation. I mentioned that most systematic reviews do ask questions about effectiveness. We do have reviews in the Campbell Library and would encourage more that look at association, for example, preschool predictors of reading comprehension, process and implementation, so the quality of targeting, and also more descriptive types of reviews and evidence gap maps, which I'll say something more about. So why we need evidence synthesis, this probably is not a surprise to you. When we look at the realm of studies published in any domain, they range from positive to negative results. But factors like outcome reporting bias, selective reporting, and confirmation bias can bias the results towards positive effects. So when we look at systematic reviews, we try to move those biases towards the middle, so we are looking at what are the effects of programs. Now I lose it. Okay. So I have 3 caveats about using systematic reviews. First, you want to use high quality reviews. This is an example from health, but it's a very famous example, the Cochrane logo. The Cochrane collaboration has over 7,000 reviews in the area of healthcare. But this logo is based on a systematic review of corticosteroids for women about to deliver prematurely. And if you had counted, you know, each of these lines on the logo represents a study with its 95% confidence intervals. And at the bottom of that logo, you see a little diamond, and that diamond represents the pooled meta-analysis of those study effects. And if you had just looked at the number of studies with statistically significant results, of these 7 studies, only 2 were statistically significant. So you might have thought that this was not an effective program. But when you pool these underpowered studies, you get a statistically significant effect, 30 to 50% reduction in mortality. So you have to use good reviews. The second point, and you probably can't read very much of this slide, but is to focus on the impact, the importance of the findings, not just the statistical significance. This is one example of payment for environmental services, where you can see the diamond on the left that shows a statistically significant effect, but this effect is 3%, and in the large scheme of things, it's not a cost-effective program, even though it is effective. I guess this is the third and last caveat, is that, you know, you can't take a systematic review and then put it into practice. You have to think about the context in which you are working, and the context of where these studies were published. One example, we have a Campbell review on conditional cash transfers that was led by Sarah Baird, where she looked at conditional and unconditional cash transfers, but I think all the studies of unconditional cash transfers are in Africa settings. All of the studies of conditional cash transfers are in Latin America. So it's difficult to generalize across settings, and you have to consider that. I guess the fourth thing about systematic reviews, and I think this ties nicely with your points about contribution analysis in the previous talk, that systematic reviews needs to be based on a theory of change. So when we think about systematic reviews, we're not thinking, does it work? We want to know why it works and in what context. This is one example of a Campbell review led by Hugh Waddington, who's actually part of 3IE, and he did a nice chain of analysis about farmer field schools, which are programs to train farmers about pesticide use with the aim of increasing yields and income. These will be really probably too small for you, but what's important to look at is that in their review, they looked at knowledge test scores as a precursor for the effect of the program. They looked at pesticide use, and then they looked at the crop yields and at the income, so that you can see that causal chain and the effects along that pathway. What they also did in that review, that's a nice example, and many Campbell reviews and others are starting to use this approach, is to also include process evaluation and qualitative data to understand why programs have their effects. Another thing that Campbell reviews, and again many other systematic reviews do, is explore the heterogeneity, explore differences within the study. So you have all these studies conducted in different settings with different populations, different interventions. You can explore what is likely to lead to better impact that can be helpful in informing policy. So these are two examples. One is conditional cash transfers, where stricter conditions resulted in greater attendance enrollment results. And the other is systematic review of school feeding, where larger effects were seen in where there was better targeting of children who are most in need. The other thing Campbell is doing is developing plain language summaries, and that might lead into some of the other talks about how you actually use systematic reviews. These are now starting to be available in Spanish. And I think the last thing I want to say is that systematic reviews are one part of the evidence base. Of course, you have a number of rigorous impact evaluations, and systematic reviews can synthesize what's available in the literature. But you can also then look at evidence maps as a way to easily find systematic reviews in a domain. You can look at evidence portals, which can collect a group of systematic reviews together in a certain area. And I think more in the area of health, you have recommendations, guidelines, and checklists, which summarize what to do. And I think those are less applicable in the kinds of sectors you're working in. But one example of an evidence map, this is inspired by 3IE. Maybe Dr. Jimenez will speak about this, but the Campbell collaboration now has 8 evidence maps registered. This is the first completed one on homelessness, where the large green circles show you that there are a lot of rigorous randomized trials, and the blue circles show where you can find systematic reviews. So they are a tool to identify reviews in a broad area. The way these are set up is the left side shows different types of interventions, and on the top and the columns are the different types of outcomes that you might be interested in. So you can also see in these pictures that there are big gaps where maybe new trials are needed. The last thing is evidence portals. We talked a little bit yesterday about summarizing evidence. And this is one example where systematic reviews are used to inform a very simple checklist. And I think it might be a little hard to read, but this is a teaching and learning toolkit by the Education Endowment Foundation. On the left, you can see the cost for the type of intervention with the sort of number of pound symbols. In the middle is the quality of the evidence, and on the far right is the size of impact, the amount of impact. So it's a very top-level tool for looking at effectiveness of a range of interventions. And another type of portal, this is being developed in Canada, is something called social systems evidence, where there's a collection of systematic reviews, not synthesized specifically for policy, but help you to find reviews on a particular question that could address your needs. So key messages, choose a high quality systematic review if you're going to use them. Think about the impact that, and the findings, not just statistical significance. Really consider context and adapt if needed. And I think this won't be a surprise to any of you. You have to try it and monitor impact as you go. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian, especially because you really map a lot of tools for generating evidence. Also, when you are not an impact evaluator or an impact researcher, it's really useful. Now it's time for Emmanuel Jimenez. He has a PhD in economics from Brown University and a master's degree in economics from the University of Toronto. He is a distinguished impact evaluation specialist with broad experience in management of international development assistance to emerging economies and leading research projects in the areas of public finance, education, health, population, welfare, and conditional cash transfer programs, among others. Likewise, he collaborated for almost 30 years with the World Bank Group in various positions, like Director of Public Sector Evaluations, Director of Human Development of East Asia and the Pacific region, and Director of Education for the South Asia region. Since 2015, he is the Executive Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, of which CONEVAL is a member, and that is one of the organizations that at the global level lead the generation and use of high-quality evidence to inform decision-making on public policy for social development in developing countries. Hello.
Thank you very much. Like Vivian, I want to thank CONEVAL and also all the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I also want to thank you for letting us speak in English. Me daba un poco vergüenza, a pesar de mi apellido. Castellano no es mi lengua materna, ni segundo ni tercero. Nací en las Filipinas. Y yo prefiero hablar en inglés y no filipiñol. Okay, 3IE is an international nonprofit that it champions the use of attributable evidence. We talked a little bit about that at the last session. So this is my presentation will be about that, as was Vivian's. A couple of things to note about 3IE. There's some material outside. One is it's a member-based organization. So when we do our advocacy as well as our championing of evidence, we do it through our members like CONEVAL. So we're very happy to have that partnership here. We generate evidence through grant making. We also do some of our own analysis. And we try to really advance the field in areas like evidence gap maps to make sure that the whole world benefits from evidence. So I just want to mention two things. One is I want to talk a little bit about the challenges for the generation and use of evidence from our perspective internationally. Since I'm an economist, we're known as dismal scientists, científicos sombríos. I want to talk about more also, what is the good news as well as the bad news. And then I want to talk about three things, I think, that are challenges that we as a community ought to address in this. So, first, in 1980, when I started my career in development, there were only about 30 or so evaluations in development being published every year. And as you can see in this graph, from then until now, there are now about almost 400 to 500 being published every year. So that's the good news, it's great news. So this is based on a database that 3IE has of all the impact evaluations, that is evaluations in which attribution is addressed in a credible way, that have been published both in journals as well as in the gray literature. So that's great. In fact, most of the growth has been in the past 15 years in this. The challenge is, the not so good news, is first of all, there's very uneven geographic and thematic coverage. So the dark areas are where there are more of these impact evaluations than others. So you can see in countries like India, Brazil, Mexico, China, there are quite a few impact evaluations. But there are some very large areas where there are very few or almost none. In fact, they happen to be in the poorer regions, such as Francophone West Africa. Here in the region in Latin America and the Caribbean, they're mostly Central America and some of the poorer countries in South America. Another gap is when we did the analysis of this, there are now almost 5,000 impact evaluations in our database. The majority of them come from 4 sectors: health, education, social protection, and agriculture. There are relatively few in sectors where large amounts of public money are being spent, such as infrastructure, or that have huge global significance, such as climate change. Another challenge is that most of these studies look at effect sizes very well, but they don't do so well in looking at the effects of subgroups. And as the world is now more concerned about those being left behind and the vulnerable groups, this is another challenge for us. There's also a usage gap as a persistent challenge. Okay, we talked about that a lot about yesterday. Now, here, let me again start with some good news and start with Mexico. So I'm from the Philippines, and I note that 3 centuries ago, for several hundred years, there was a galleon that brought the riches from the Far East to Mexico and then on to Spain in the Manila galleon. Now I think there's a reverse shipment of knowledge coming from Latin America and Mexico to East Asia. And I want to tell you, and this comes from your assessment, the evaluation of Progresa or Oportunidades or Prospera, okay, to East Asia. Because East Asia, until recently, had very few social protection programs because East Asians didn't believe in them. They believed that the way to grow out to protect people was to grow rapidly, and they've been pretty successful. But it's also true that because there are social protection programs such as conditional cash transfers that help you grow and protect the poor. And it's through the analysis that's been done here that countries like the Philippines are now benefiting from that knowledge. The challenge is that this doesn't happen all the time. There are in fact many studies which aren't being used enough for the analysis. This 47% number comes from my former employer, the World Bank. As you know, the World Bank does a lot of impact evaluations. It's one of the leaders globally. Okay? Now, when I was working for the independent evaluation group at the World Bank, all the World Bank projects have to have a self-evaluation of what their impact is. And we in the evaluation department had to actually assess whether or not that judgment was valid. We weren't very popular. Okay. That number 47% says that less than half of all the impact evaluations that the World Bank did were quoted in the self-evaluations of the projects. They weren't being used. So there have been great advances, but there are still great challenges. So let me just mention 3 things that I think we from 3IE have been doing to try to address some of these. Because what we need to do is to ask the question, why do these challenges persist? If evaluation is such a great idea, why isn't it blindingly obvious you should do all of this yourself? Well, first of all, evaluations are difficult, especially in key areas where attribution is very hard. So there could be chunky, large-scale projects in which it's like dams or infrastructure, where it's very hard to get a control group. These are national programs. Complex interventions, I think there's a couple of sessions on this, that are difficult to implement, or where the causal chain is very long and there are multiple pathways for getting there. So from, I think what we see now is that to address these, there are a number of things that have to be done. First of all, it's very important to innovate in methods. It's also very important not to just rely on one method, that you have to use a series of them and to make sure that you have the right data. Not just using surveys, but perhaps big data to bring those in to address some of these questions. For example, in 3IE, we, with the help of DFID actually, have a thematic window called Development Priorities, which are trying to have more impact evaluations in those key areas like infrastructure, which are understudied. One of these studies that we've funded is of the Beijing Metro to look at the environmental effects and the pollution effects and traffic effects of extending the Berlin Metro. And the researchers are using big data on both environmental as well as traffic to address this problem. A second is that, as we saw yesterday in some of the sessions, policy decisions are complex. So when I was going to university, we had this model as economists of the benevolent dictator. And what we did as economists was we thought up what is good advice we would give to them, okay? And these benevolent dictators just needed the evidence to behave in the right way. So there are people like that. The reality is, as you know, is that policymakers don't always, there's not such a linear track. This is actually I Googled parliament fights. And there are many pictures like this of people actually, policymakers, making policies in not so linear way, okay? So what this means for us is a number of things, I think, as evaluators. The first thing is it's very important for us to understand who are the key influencers, okay? And we talked a lot about that yesterday, and I won't do that anymore. But also, we talked yesterday about understanding their incentives, and there were several sessions on that. How do we make sure that those who are influencing these people have the right incentives to bring evidence to bear on their decisions? It's also important to build capacity, not just on the generators of evidence, okay, but also on those who use them, to make sure they understand what this is about and how you use it in their decisions. And finally, and this we didn't talk so much about yesterday, but we believe that public transparency is really key, because sometimes you don't know who are the people who are influencing the policymakers. And what we believe as a public good is, if the data are out there, or the studies are out there available for everybody, then that should stimulate a public debate that is going to be ultimately very healthy for society. The third and final thing I want to say is to make sure that the incentives of the evidence producers and users are better aligned. And that was just mentioned earlier. So people say that they're not only, they ask the question, are they even in the same wavelength? some people say, are they from the same planets, okay? Maybe are researchers from Mars and implementers and policymakers from Venus, okay? So here, what we've learned in 3IE is that it's very important to engage early in a sustained way. That was just mentioned actually in the previous conversation. You might give up actually a little bit an independence on this, and that is a reality. That's because you're in bringing in the evaluators early, but we believe that it's more important to make sure that the evaluation is relevant rather than completely independent. As I said, it's also important to build capacity to demand good impact evaluations. It's very important to communicate well. That was just mentioned as well by Vivian. Two things on that: bring in professionals, and this other Vivian mentioned is synthesize well, because now that we have 5,000 impact evaluations out there, as Vivian mentioned, they're not all going to be saying the same thing, and it's very important to help policymakers make sense of all the evidence. And finally, we need to have evaluations that come in a timely way to when decisions are being made. So one example of this is in Mozambique, when Mozambique is a country, like many African countries, that doesn't have early childhood development, unlike here in Latin America where it is more popular. So in Mozambique, there was an evaluation which showed that if you have early child development, it actually resulted in learning gains of 25 to 30% of kids in primary school. Now, the researchers brought that along, but they also managed to identify who the decision makers were. It included not just people in government, but also civil society and donors in Madagascar. But it was also done in a very timely way. Okay? It happened that that evaluation came just as the government was, in fact, reassessing its education strategy. And as a result, in about 2 years ago, Mozambique now has a very large-scale education, early child development program. So, in sum, despite good progress, there are still gaps in knowledge and use of evidence-based in decision-making. In 3IE's experience, the most promising ways we do this are address this as to innovate on methods, understand better how decisions are made in a political economy sense, and finally to improve the alignment between those from Mars and those from Venus. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Manny, because it complemented beautiful with what Vivian just presented us. And finally, we have Gonzalo Hernández. He is Executive Secretary of the National Council for Evaluation of Social Development Policy. I have to say it in English, CONEVAL. Its function is to coordinate the activities of the Council, as well as to execute the actions and decisions that are taken within the governing body and the Executive Commission of CONEVAL. The purpose of CONEVAL is to evaluate the policy and social development programs, as well as to carry out the measurement of poverty in the country. Gonzalo holds a PhD in economics from the University of Oxford, England, Masters in economics from the University of Essex, and BA in economics from the ITAM. He is currently professor and researcher of the academic departments, and he will present the evidence that is in CONEVAL.
Thank you very much, Thania, and thank you very much. I want to stress how happy and how lucky we are that Manny and Vivian are here, because they represent leaders in terms of producing evidence globally. They represent leaders in producing rigorous and new methods rigorously. So we are very happy that you are here. In fact, they are going to detail more their work this afternoon at 5:30 at CONEVAL. Man is going to present with more detail what 3IE is doing, and Vivian is going to comment on that. Thank you very much, Vivian. So if you want to know more about what they are doing as leaders in producing evidence and rigorous evidence, you are welcome to come to CONEVAL 5:30 this afternoon. What I would like to do, with the help from Thania, I want to ask her to carry on in what we do at CONEVAL. It's just to tell you, to remind you that when CONEVAL was created, so of course the main idea was how can we produce evidence on social policy for other actors. And we have many actors who are willing, or who need at least, evidence in social policy. We do have the minister and the under ministers of social development, of course, but we also have program managers. We have the Minister of Finance, because the Minister of Finance main task is to produce the budget every year. And one important question when you are producing a budget is, where do I spend the scarce resources? Where do I go in terms of resources? Shall I keep financing Progresa? Shall I go and finance a new program? So imagine the challenge of the next president in 6 months' time. He needs, together with Congress, they need to get the budget for 2019. So imagine the thing is, in which programs we're going to put money. And so it's a mixture of decisions that you have there in the middle. You have political reasons, you have pressures from big shots, you have pressures from your friends and colleagues, you have pressures from your party, but also you have to deliver properly. You have to, you promise to the people of Mexico that you're going to be elected because you're going to solve their problems. So if you're going to solve our problems, then you need to deliver. Then you need to know which programs we're going to favor in terms of budgets in order to fulfill those promises. And therefore, the Minister of Finance, for them, having good evidence is important. We also need to produce evidence for citizens who pay taxes or who are doing some research or who have to do some homework, for instance. They need to have sometimes information and data on social policies. So therefore, we have a range of agents who need to have evidence. And therefore, the challenge of CONEVAL at the beginning is what type of evidence we shall produce in a systematic way for many agents in Mexico and sometimes abroad. And what is actually happening in CONEVAL, as some of you may know, is that we do have a range of tools, and we have a range of ways in summarizing those tools. I have to be honest with my friends, that at the very beginning, when we started at CONEVAL like 11 years ago, 12 years ago, and we came from academia, and we were really keen on rigorous and very rigorous evaluation, and of course, rigorous impact evaluations, we thought at the beginning, at least I thought at the beginning, that the only tools we're going to use in CONEVAL, to produce in CONEVAL, were going to be impact evaluations. So we were really, I mean, I remember almost the first 2 months that I arrived as being General Director of Evaluation at the Ministry of Social Development. Over the first 2 months, we had someone from London, from the IFS, to train us again in impact evaluation. So at the end of those 2 or 3 months, my team, which was a very technical team, we were really sharp on techniques. We were really good on that. So with those tools, say, well, now we're going to conquer the world because we know impact evaluations. And of course, with experience from Progressa, we had that example behind. So we really thought that it was the only thing we're going to do. Very soon in CONEVAL, in CONEVAL, we realized that only producing one type of tool, even if it's a very important one, wasn't going to be enough for our clients. If you remember, the very first evaluations we produced in 2001, 2002, those evaluations through a mandate from Congress saying we need to have annually evaluations for all programs in the federal government, which means like 500 or 600 evaluations every year. And in fact, that mandate from Congress said impact evaluation. I think they don't know what they're saying. So it was very difficult to have impact evaluations every year for every program. And at the same time, our friends from the Ministry of Finance, they were really keen on having some information for all programs every year. Not impact evaluation, of course, but some type of a kind of reliable indicators and reliable evaluations. So with this in mind, with many elements in mind, what we have so far, what we have now, is a range of products. We do have impact evaluations, of course. We are pursuing synthetic reviews as well. We are working on evidence gaps, and this is all with the help from people and institutions such as yours. And we are keen in producing more important and rigorous tools and sensitive reviews, but we're doing something else. For instance, one very important piece of evidence, it is not even an evaluation, is the poverty measurement that we have. That is evidence in a different way. Without that evidence, I think CONEVAL's work over the past 10 years has been almost reduced to 60% of what we do. And with 60% or 70% reduce of our impact on society. So we do have our poverty measurement, multidimensional one, as you know. We do have many other tools in which we want to have a range of things, and a range of tools for many clients. So let me just give the mic to Thania, so she can carry on explaining to us briefly a range of things that we do in a systematic way besides the poverty measurement and even besides impact evaluation and the type of things that we pack together in order for our clients to have a better understanding of the evidence we have.
Well, actually, like Gonzalo said, we have a range of tools that we produce. And we produce it thinking about three things that Manny said in his presentation. First, who are the relevant or key actors? Second, or influencers. Second, the timeliness is really, really important. And the third is trying to align the incentives between producers and users. And as Gonzalo said, CONEVAL is a producers. So I just want to say that we are trying, not yet fulfilling, but we are trying. So actually, one of the main tools we have every 2 years is the evaluation report of the social development policy. What we do in that report is gather all the information we get from the poverty measurement, but also of the indicators analysis and also of the evaluations. And what we do is concentrated to do an assessment of the effectiveness of the social policy. And every year we kind of change it a little bit, but the last one, the 2016, and this one, 2018 report, enhance the effectiveness exercise of social rights established in the general law. So what we do is a large report, but actually it's a large report that you can use it in pieces. If you're interested in health, you can only use the health chapter, or if you're interested in the gaps between groups, you can also use that chapter. Another tool that we have and we have been doing it since 2008. It's a document we called the Considerations for the Budgetary Process. What we do, and as Gonzalo said, the Hacienda is really interested in using evidence, maybe to start shaping the budget, the federal budget. And we say start shaping because the way they use it, it's for negotiate with the ministries. Not in order to actually put some more money or less money in some things, but start negotiating and aligning the incentives for the results instead of for the outcomes instead of the outputs. So actually what we do in this document, and it's been changing over time, but right now the main part of this document is the categorize of the programs in priority and non-priority. What we do is that we, using the impact evaluations or another evaluation, but also using national data, what we use is trying to gather evidence in order to actually set if one program have effects in some of the poverty dimensions. Thank you. Poverty dimensions. So what we do is, if they have some effect and we can measure it, they are priority. If we cannot measure them or they don't have it, they are non-priority. And what we have seen is when we give this information to Hacienda in the long way, and you can see it in the PowerPoint, the budget of the priority programs are bigger or falls less than the non-priority. Another tool is on annual reports on program performance. What we do, and as Vivian and Manny also said, is really complex to start giving information to people. They are not researchers, they are not evaluators, but also they don't have time to analyze these things. So what we have been doing is using all the information of the evaluations, the homogeneous evaluations of all social reports, and what we do is actually a traffic light report, and using some dimensions like outstanding, adequate, moderate. What we can give is the programs, some of these grades of some elements as design, outcomes, implementation, using evidence to improve. So this is an annual report, and this is a database that we give Hacienda and all the ministries each year. And actually what there is, this is the great tool to negotiate budget. Another one, what we do is actually working more in like the Campbell Declaration and 3IE, is trying to gather evidence. So what really works in public policy. A lot of key policy policy actors ask us, well, I want to reduce malnutrition. So what do I do? What should I do with that? So what are we doing is first actually doing a repository of systematic reviews that you already do. We use the Campbell and also the concrete collaboration, also the What Works Clearinghouse, and also 3IE to start doing repository of systematic reviews, translating in Spanish, and putting in a database that they can use when they have when they are interested in some things. And what we do is, Gonzalo is always doing these reunions with secretary, with ministers, and he said, well, they are interested in some key problems, so we start analyzing those. The next one is actually doing practical guidelines for improving public policy. Is kind of systematic reviews, kind of, yes, kind of, because actually what we thought is that it was easier to do. So the first one, it took 4 years to do it. So when Gonzalo and all the other advisors come to us and said, well, what is it? And we said, well, we didn't have it yet. But so what we do is a kind of systematic reviews, but with a shorter process in a Mexican way. But also what we do in these practical guidelines is actually doing very, with a really graphic way that all public officers may find attractive, and can, in one page, you can have results of a systematic reviews. So, but also the types of, one thing that we use to choose the studies, the impact evaluations, is if in Mexico they are doing some kind of that policies. So actually we use that to categorize it, and we have been doing this. Right now we only have one, but in this year maybe we could all, if we are lucky, we could have 5 more. Lucky, yes, because if Janet is in a good mood, we can have another one. And well, and also what we also have is policy evaluations, and we call it strategic evaluations. And what we do here is analyzing a problem, analyzing a group of programs, and these past 2 years, what we are analyzing are social rights. And what we do this is because in the social law we have 8 social rights, and what we did is a homogeneous methodology to do diagnosis in order to say to all actors, especially the ones that are running for presidents, that of course attending poverty is important, but also doing a lot of action in order to that every person can have access to social rights. It's the goal, the most important goal. So what we did is a diagnosis of social rights in homogeneous ways using 3 dimensions: accessibility, disponibility, and quality. And right now what we're doing is some diagnosis, and we will be able to publish them in around 2 months. And we have a lot of indicators, so everyone can know where is the gaps and where you can say that you already have access to your social rights. So that's it, and thank you very much. So right now I open the time for questions, please.
Well, I have a question for Vivian. When dealing with systematic reviews, it is clear that you must have like some pre-established criteria to do the study. But when I saw the slide about like the homelessness evidence gap map, I was like very curious, how do you deal with choosing the outcome variables? Because I think that's not as clear as with like choosing which studies to like have in the systematic review. So yeah, it's a very broad question, but I think you can maybe talk about that.
So in that particular evidence gap map, the Campbell collaboration worked with Crisis, which has a Center for Homelessness Impact. So with stakeholders in the homeless community to identify what are the important outcomes. I'm working on an evidence gap map myself in the area of aging, and we included stakeholders. So a bit like Dr. Jimenez suggested that really evidence gap maps, it's really important to have stakeholders working in the field who can help with the domains for the outcomes.
I have a question, is for Vivian or Manny. Which are the most important characteristics in the presentation of evidence in order to have more possibilities to be taken into account and to close the gap between the researchers and the policymakers?
That's a good question. I think that first of all, you have to understand the incentives of both the policymakers and the researchers, and it's very easy to have stereotypes in which all researchers, all they want to do is just publish their papers, and policymakers, all they want is, I want the information yesterday, and I don't care about anything else. In fact, it's a much grayer area. I know many researchers, especially the senior ones, they don't have to worry about tenure anymore. They're concerned about having an influence, okay? And at the same time, there are many policymakers who are very thoughtful and understand, okay? So I think we have to start from there, that not characterize people as, I was being a bit facetious and naughty in telling you about Mars and Venus, but I do think that it is a gray area. A couple of things that come to mind. One is communications, as we both mentioned, okay? Vivian, you mentioned as an editor, it's very important to have summaries. You have these nice graphics. We did a systematic review in 3IE on what the world knows about what impacts education learning outcomes and participation. So it's a huge topic. The first draft, in fact, the one that's online, is 750 pages long, okay? But we have a 40-page version and a 2-page version, okay, as well, okay? And that took a lot of time, but it's really worth it. So communications. The second is, I think in doing that, you need to have a multidisciplinary team, because not all researchers will ever be good communicators. And they shouldn't be. You can't force them. And so you need to have professionals come in and work with them. And for researchers, that's sometimes difficult, okay? But we've seen examples where that has worked. And I do think, thirdly, that this transparency is important. That if you believe that all of your data are going to be out in the public domain, okay, then I think you'll be actually more careful about how to make sure that it's in a good enough way. So I think that transparency is another tool for addressing some of these things.
I I agree with many. I mean, we did do, we have done a systematic review about policy briefs as one tool that's used. So that's a way of summarizing findings with consideration for policy and context that has some considerations about applicability, you know, equity, and things like that. So tries to, you know, communicate. And I think sometimes you do need professionals to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Vivian, I want to ask you, what, in your opinion, what are the most important challenges for, not only for doing systematic reviews, but for using systematic reviews? Because in my experience, it's very, very difficult to communicate usefulness for these tools. And for many, what do you think about qualitative methods for to measure impact or effectiveness?
That's a loaded question. The most challenge for doing reviews and for using them. I think for doing reviews, having done many in the middle of some, it's getting the questions right. So I think you want to have questions about exploring heterogeneity that are driven by the policy reality. So, and that can involve being engaged with stakeholders in an advisory board capacity, which takes academics a little out of their comfort zone, but I think yields answers to questions that people in policy have. So I think that's a big challenge for systematic reviews, is how to do that well. For using reviews, I think it's putting reviews into context, you know, and reviews can do a better job of making that easier, but a 700-page report, you know, won't work. So I think there just need to be a summary of the findings and the context in which they were done. And that's one of the things I was saying about policy briefs, is they can sort of summarize, you know, where are the studies done, and how could this, what is the applicability of this, and what would you need to consider in order to apply these results in another setting. So I think those are big, hope that helps.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think what Vivian mentioned earlier about bringing the stakeholders in to ask them, what are the outcomes you're interested in? And to help them define actually what the review will look like will be very important. Now, the downside of that is then they may not want to wait 2 years for the systematic review to be finished, because they have to make the decision much sooner. So the challenge, we can talk about this later this afternoon, Gonzalo, is how do you make this more rapid? Are there techniques to make sure that this is being done? And the machine learning, is that going to be possible? So we can discuss that later. I think on the qualitative side, it's a really great question. I actually meant to say something about that. And when I said about how we, and Gonzalo, you alluded to do as well, you know, impact evaluations are just one of the tools that we have in our toolbox to fix problems and to address policies. Sometimes we specialize so much, we only want to use that tool, okay? But I think that what we're learning is that if you want to make sure that you're having an impact, you have to use all of them. And qualitative benefits are really very important. We've just done actually a paper on reviewing all of the good quantitative analysis that's been done and asking the question, which of them have actually also incorporated qualitative work well? This is for settle. And what's interesting is that in many studies, when you have both quantitative and qualitative, they're typically in two different sections. Okay? What we found is that there are relatively few, but there are some that integrate them well. And what does it mean to integrate them well? It's going to be very important to make sure that the qualitative work's being used, to form your hypotheses, to make sure that you have the right way to collect data, and the third is that you triangulate, that is, you try to verify whether or not your quantitative work is actually being verified by your qualitative analysis. And finally, the qualitative work is immensely useful in questions about implementation, which you really can't get out of the quantitative work. So those are just some of the lessons I think that are very important, but I think it is for evaluators, integrating the quantitative and qualitative analysis is still an ongoing challenge.
Yes, I have a question. Because when you start doing these kind of systematic reviews or some things to generate evidence, what most time it's a really frustrating process. Because you do a lot of things, and when you get the results, maybe it's like nothing is working. Nothing is good to attempt to address the problem. You think you want to analyze. So how do you deal with that? But also, I want to, if you can, Vivian, can you share a little bit? When you, in your presentation, you said assess impact, not just statistic significance, and maybe it's a little bit related with my question.
Okay, well, maybe the first question about, finding very little impact or no differences, I think is still an important finding. So one example of a Campbell review is in social welfare, was quite important on a type of family therapy called multisystemic therapy that found that it was no better than alternatives. Then gave people who are practicing the option that you should choose the alternatives on the basis of other features, of the families or the setting, acceptability, feasibility, values, these kinds of things that are important for decisions, also in policy. So I think it's still meaningful, yeah. Then your second question, a little bit more complicated. So, yes, can you repeat it in a different way?
What do you mean about assessing
The impact, yes. Okay, yeah, so the impact. So I come from a very clinical background in musculoskeletal research in Cochrane, where it's really easy because clinicians and patients have decided, what's important, like an amount of pain that I feel better, I can walk upstairs, I think in social impact, it's very different because you are looking, even a small impact on a very large population can be very important, which is, I think, why a lot of Campbell reviews are starting to think more about cost and thinking about value and return on investment, because even a small impact can be important, and it's the same in public health. So, and there's not, I think, in clinical work, there are a number of efforts to think about what's an important amount of difference on clinical outcomes. I think in population and public health, social policy, you don't have benchmarks. So I think, again, stakeholder engagement about what's an important difference, for poverty reduction, for example, is kind of the best that you can do. And for systematic reviews, that's another level of effort that they need to engage with, is what's an important amount of impact on those important outcomes.
Can I add something then? Can I also ask you a question? So I think your question on what do it is frustrating, and that's true. But if it were easy, then it wouldn't be so much fun, right? Just three things I'd say. Well, that are really important to take into account is why is it that you may not find an impact, okay? So one possibility is that this has been tried 100 times and nothing worked. That I'd give up on, okay? Those are programs that, forget it, okay? But there are many studies in which the average effect size is not significantly different from 0 because there's such a large variance. It worked in some areas and not in others. Context matters, and the kind of analysis that Vivian talked about then is very important. A third possibility is that these are really great ideas, okay? But really, when you come down to it, there are only 2 or 3 studies, and it's not enough to be done. So I think it's very important to distinguish among those possibilities when you're talking about not impact. My question to Gonzalo and you, Thania, and CONEVAL is, you said that you have a variety of tools, and impact evaluation is one of them. What are your criteria for deciding what to do impact evaluation on?
Yeah, so it is a crucial question, that one, because as you can understand, it will be great to have really rigorous impact evaluations for a whole range of programs and a whole range of sectors, so we can have really evidence in everywhere. But you face various challenges. A, resources. So you need to pick up 1, 2, or 3, or 4, whatever, according to your budget. Then you need to focus on which areas and which programs or which. So what we have done recently, or so far in CONEVAL, is try to select areas related to the poverty dimensions we have. So if our poverty dimensions are important elements for governments, for their social policies, then we understand that they need answers on those dimensions. Of course, when we have 7 dimensions, it's still a broad thing. But there are, so let me give you an example, 2 examples. One of the elements that reduce poverty is having cement floors in houses. And there is 1, 2, or 3 programs, perhaps one, federal one, who's dealing with cement floors. Therefore, for governments, it's quite easy to understand which is the way and which is the program to reduce poverty through cement floors. So the uncertainty there is not that great. However, we have another dimension where we don't know quite well, and not yet, which are the best programs to reduce poverty through the dimension of access to food. So the way we measure access to food, which is through food insecurity, it's a specific indicator. There are very few programs in which we can link that dimension with those programs. And that question is still present for governments. So when poverty goes up due to this indicator, due to this dimension, then the question from the government is, all right, so tell me, how can I reduce that dimension? And CONEVAL goes like, well, I don't know, well, and that's the reason why, Manny, we asked 3IE through Janet. Janet was still Janet Brown in Washington. Well, Mario Picon and all, to help us to get rapid ways, systematic ways, to gather information, to understand which programs around the world have dealt with food insecurity. So that is one second element. A third element is some priorities by our council members, where we think that that area or that program is important. A fourth element is when we have demands from programs. So if there's a program which is willing to do an impact evaluation through what our exercise that we have, ¿cómo se llama? The incubator, impact incubator, where our friends from JPAL and others have helped us to have our impact evaluation incubator with many programs, and at the end of the day, 1 or 2 or 3 programs on that process are selected because they want to have that. Of course, on that fourth element, on that fourth case or criteria, then you may have a problem where you may only end producing impact evaluations for good programs, programs who are willing to participate, and therefore you are not capturing the worst programs. In fact, I've been thinking that for many circumstances and in many countries, whenever you have an impact evaluation in a program, it's like a signal that is a good program. So impact evaluation becomes like a stamp that that's a good program. But I wonder if you have another, no? Yeah? I have a question for you now, since I have my, as we know, it is not easy for public, for policymakers, for politicians, to use evidence in a systematic way. So all of us, we're trying to convince them to use evidence somehow, our evidence, of course, and go beyond Twitter news or newspapers and magazines. So our challenge, so my question is, sometimes we are successful in convincing some policymakers to read and to understand and to use one impact evaluation. Prospera, Progresa, Piso Firme, and many others that we have in Mexico. So we are lucky that this guy was actually reading the impact, he understood it, and now they're making decisions on that. So that's a great asset. But then, our friends from the systematic review world can say, well, hold on. That's only one impact evaluation. You have to look to many impact evaluations to have a precise decision if you're going to carry on with that program or not. So we have to tell that policymaker that he ended up reading and understanding one single impact evaluation. Say, hold on, why don't you wait 1 year or 2 so I have a synthetic review, and when I have it finished, then you can know properly if you're going to have the proper evidence. So how can we convince these guys that they have to wait a bit in order to have the better evidence? And my second question is, in your experience, are there precise governments in various countries, I'm living aside Mexico, that they are willing to engage in evidence in a systematic way? Have you spotted specific governments around the world where you say, well, these guys are really keen on trying to get evidence and use evidence?
Thank you. Okay, so I think the question that you asked is, how do you convince policymakers to be patient? Is that? I'm not sure there's an answer to that. Just let me mention 2 things, Gonzalo. One is that the reason that our world is different from the medical world is that our interventions aren't are hardly ever exactly the same. Whereas in health sciences and medicine, you know, it's a pill, and so it's pretty simple. And so once it's proven, it scales up immediately, okay? And I think what I would say is that we have to make some subjective judgments that if interventions are quite similar to each other and the context is quite similar, then you don't need to wait, okay? You just go ahead. But if it's really quite specific, then you really have to be careful. And what I would say to them is do it, but build in an evaluation with process and formative evaluations in your own program and learn from it as you're going along, okay? And that's what my recommendation would be. In fact, in the Philippines, when we convinced them, because of Progresa and Oportunidades, I was the World Bank at the time, that conditional cash transfers, I think they should try. We also said, but you also have to build in your own evaluations, because just because it worked in Colombia and Mexico doesn't mean it's going to work here. And that's what they've done. Your other question was, can you, what? The UK is is one. Actually, is a great champion of evidence in in developing in general. Look, I think that what can I say on this? If the question is, are there countries that have a systematic way of doing it? Then we have examples like in of richer countries such as in South Africa, where they have a policy. What was interesting to me is that there are a couple of cases, even of poorer countries, where if you have the right individuals who are committed, you can make a big difference. So we know from Benin, for example, here's a country relatively poor, in which there are a couple of people whom we've interacted with as 3IE, in which they're trying to make a difference, not just for Benin, but for their neighbors. Okay? The problem with that is it's very individual specific, and the question is, what happens if they leave or change their tune? I remember, again, let me mention, in the Philippines, we have a country policy window. In a country policy window in 3IE, the evaluation questions aren't formed by the donors or formed by the researchers. It's formed by the countries themselves, like in Mexico here. And I asked the Minister of Planning, who was the one who coordinated all of government to prioritize, why is it that the country is, you have all these ministers lining up? And he said something very interesting. This is with the previous administration. He said, when my colleagues and I as ministers go to a cabinet meeting, the president asks us, why are you proposing this? What do you know if it's worked elsewhere or not? So my only lesson is it has to come from the top. That really helps. And if that message comes through, then it's been interesting to me just what a powerful motivator that is. But it also gives me great fear, because when the top is not involved, as in some countries which will go unmentioned, which happen to be very rich that are north of here, then it's really hard for the system.
I think that Manny answered those questions, so I think it's better to go to the floor.
So, if one, yeah.
Sí, en relación con el uso de las revisiones sistemáticas,
Yes.
uno de los puntos importantes de las claves que ponías, Vivian, de las revisiones sistemáticas era el adaptar las evaluaciones a los contextos específicos. Cuando nosotros tratamos de encontrar evidencia para un tipo de intervención específica aquí en México, si hay evidencia con respecto a revisiones sistemáticas, en ocasiones hay una brecha que nos cuesta trabajo cerrar, porque hay cierta heterogeneidad en la evidencia entre distintas intervenciones sobre si funciona o no funciona. Parecería que hay una brecha que tiene que ver con el juicio del analista de políticas públicas para poder decir si esa intervención debería de seguir o no debería de seguir. ¿Tienes alguna o tienen alguna recomendación sobre cómo el analista podría cerrar esta brecha sin perder objetividad sobre la evidencia que hay sobre evaluación de impacto?
Do you use models of data mining or text mining for search evaluation impact, or what is the process to search the evaluations?
I think your question is that when you're looking at adapting to context, you sometimes have multiple reviews, not always saying the same thing, and then you need to make a decision about what is, applicable in your setting. I think this is a really interesting challenge for systematic review organizations like ours, that there are now multiple reviews on the same questions. I think you need to look at first the question which is most suited to what your question is. So, the eligibility criteria and the inclusion criteria is a very big point for systematic reviews coming to different conclusions. And I think the second point is to look at the quality of the reviews. Reviews which have not been as comprehensive in their search may come to different conclusions if they are finding, unpublished evidence and so on. So I think for policy, that's very difficult to do, which is why I brought up the point about evidence portals that can start to bring these things together, so they can synthesize. And I think, like Manny's point, we have to synthesize now really in a body of evidence where there are multiple reviews, and try to put those in context. Yeah.
So I think your question was about the repository and of impact evaluations and how we got the 5,000 in there. And basically we do some of the, we actually look at database searches in which we have certain criteria. And one of the criteria that's important is that someone's actually read all of the abstracts and all of the articles to make sure that some way to address attribution is actually in the article. So there are these actually very similar to the searches that are done for systematic reviews, in which you start with tens of thousands of titles and come down to the articles. And in the end, someone actually has to read them to make sure that they're there. Now we're now doing a reanalysis to upgrade that database to have better searches, because right now it's text mining that's going on. But I think now some questions people want to ask more systematically about regions and subsectors we're going to build in. So we're investing in the next year and a half ways to improve the search capacity of that repository.
After a certain research, most of the times we have a really intense analysis, statistical significance, and all this information that is really important. But most of the times, when we look only the last part, sometimes we do not have a conclusion that says something that could make maybe not a happy response to that. So what will be a suggestion for us that use that information, not to only keep the number 0.5, 0.5, 2, it is significant or not, in the way to really use that information and make it more, I don't know how to say it, more usable. Yeah, kind of useful. Thank you.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días.
Wait.
Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español, sí.
Sí.
Sí. Bueno, ya habíamos hablaron un poco sobre las evaluaciones de impacto cualitativas, pero quiero hacer énfasis en, bueno, cómo es el escenario de las evaluaciones cualitativas en el repositorio de 3IE y en Collaboration, en Campbell Collaboration. ¿Cómo les va? O sea, no cuántas tenemos, pero sí un poco cuáles han sido los retos para incluir evaluaciones cualitativas de impacto. Esta gráfica que mostraba Emmanuel del incremento enorme en las evaluaciones de impacto en los años 2000, también cuenta para las evaluaciones de impacto cualitativas, o sea, un poco como cuál es el reto metodológico también de las evaluaciones cualitativas de impacto. Gracias.
Thank you. That's a great question about the importance of the findings. I think what we encourage our Campbell authors to do is to situate the findings into policy relevance. So one thing you can do is compare those effects to other kinds of programs that have an aim to influence the same types of outcomes. So I could say, for example, when you think of child nutrition, you could compare different programs in their impact on child nutritional outcomes, which might be a way to think about how important the findings are. Particularly if you can look at, comparisons of budgetary decisions related to those programs. Other programs might help to situate your findings in that body of evidence.
So the question about the qualitative analysis in 3IE, unfortunately, the repository that we have is only of the quantitative analysis. When I'm talking about the qualitative analysis, these are the analysis that we actually have ourselves supported within 3IE that's in our files. So we do have in our files the qualitative analysis as well as the quantitative one. In the final report that is supposed to be integrated, some studies do it better than others. And what I was talking about was not based on the repository, but based on the studies that we ourselves have supported within 3IE that's in our files.
Well, thank you very much for joining us in this discussion panel. Manny, Vivian, Gonzalo, thank you for such a richful presentations, and thank you all for your generosity and patience to be with us. Yes, 5:30 at CONEVAL to join us in a really richful presentation, detailed presentation with Manny and Vivian. Thank you.